Welcome to the DNA Talks podcast, where we take on the mission of unlocking the code of your genetics. This season is all about you, upgrading your health, not just on the surface, but down to the root cause. Join us as your clinicians at the DNA company investigate your DNA and beyond. The intention of this podcast is to enhance your lifestyle by changing what is in your control. This does not substitute the medical advice given by your personal doctor, therapist, and other healthcare professionals.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Man Up. That's a podcast series where we're diving deep into men's health, unearthing root causes of health challenges. And we've all got them, every one of us, in order to pave the way for a long and healthy life. And in this series, of course, we're inspired by the DNA's company's mission to revolutionize how we all experience health and medicine. We've pioneered the first functionally interpreted DNA testing, providing groundbreaking insights into our genetic blueprint. So welcome back. And, as Justin and I explore these innovations, trying to help empower all of you guys to man up in the literal and figurative sense. We use that with large degrees of variation in interpretation, don't we, Justin? I mean, manning up can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. We mean it, but with some level of, what would be the vernacular here that we would use?
Owning up. Let's call it that, right? Owning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're unfolding the science and the stories around what ultimately we could use in diet and lifestyle and nutrition, nutraceuticals. Today, we're talking all about hormones, men's hormones. It's what drives us, what drives all of us, gender, specific, non-specific, men and women. But before we get down into the weeds on hormones, we always like to start off this series with what's trending, what we see, what our antenna have brought our awareness or has passed through across our desks in the world of functional medicine, biohacking, the latest in health and wellness. So let's start with your latest intrigue. What do you got?
Yeah, so my latest intrigue is actually more so on the cultural front, I would say, than the medicine front. I've really just had this on my mind lately about ego and the picture that gets painted around ego. And I think it's especially applicable to men. But people say that it's bad, right? They like to talk about ego as being the enemy. And because we're talking about testosterone today, testosterone is such a driver. I think that ego is something that we shouldn't suppress all the way to ground zero, because that's going to make it so that people walk all over you, right? I think that ego actually plays a role, and you should have a healthy amount of it, because that's actually going to lead to you being a little bit more ambitious, right? It's you got to have your voice heard in the world too. So, the media likes to paint it like your ego is this evil thing. It can be used in that way, but let's not suppress it all the way to nothing, because then you're a doormat, and we got to make sure that we're manning up in the world. What about you?
I love it. No, I love it. And I just got a comment before I share mine. It reminds me of a study, and I was drawing as you're talking to try to remember where it came. I think UCLA, somewhere in the West, US, maybe even an Ivy League school. But they did a study on guys attending a football game, and they studied the amount of testosterone before and after for those individuals, particularly who bet on a certain outcome versus those and won versus those that lost. And how those individuals that had won and been expressive of their ego, and not only their team won, they won money, and they felt, I guess sort of, competitive in the moment, their testosterone shot up, as opposed to the other group who ultimately lost. I mean, there's not exactly ego as you're describing, but there's no harm in that level of sportsmanship and celebration and ego and all that. It's healthy for us. We are that way driven. So yes, to suppress that and without getting, as you're describing, overly egocentric. I love that. Mine was really more in this sort of general realm of some new findings around, and we'll probably even talk loosely about this later on in the show and the podcast relevant to hormones and guys, but the concept of exposome-metabolome interactions throughout lifespan. So what's hit my attention is really this sort of, we've talked about this, nature, nurture. We're all about nature in the DNA company. What are our genes, right? What are our objective genomic endpoints that describe our playbook? But exposome-metabolome interactions, focusing on the understanding how environment exposures, especially in early childhood, maybe even in utero, impact health across our entire lifespan and health span. So this research sort of intersects with exposomics, metabolomics, and environmental toxicology. We've heard about all these chemicals that have become more and more consistent and homogeneous in our environment. But providing deeper insights into the ways these environmental factors influence our biology and contribute to chronic disease, particularly on the impact of mitochondrial DNA. So not our genomic pathways, but the mitochondria, which, by the way, interestingly enough, we get from mom, as you know. So early exposures to environmental chemicals altering mitochondrial DNA, which has huge implications, since, of course, mitochondrial function is crucial for energy production, cell-to-cell signaling, general overall health. So that's hit my radar. It's a new and upcoming area of focus within functional medicine. We've always appreciated toxicology, but this exposome-metabolome interaction I find intriguing, and my attention sort of veered toward, because, and again, as we might discuss later on, hormones are incredibly impacted, particularly testosterone, by environmental exposures to those things that most often will mimic estrogen, right? We don't hear a lot of things that mimic androgens in the environment, but certainly a lot of things that mimic and emulate estrogen, which opposes the very male-based hormone that we want sort of flowing freely in our body. So I think before we get into this sort of how to best understand uniqueness within each of us and of one, we're always talking about that, right? Personalized approaches using genomics, objective lab parameters. We'll talk about that. Let's talk about how this story around male hormones has never been, and certainly will never be, just testosterone. This is beyond that, correct?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, testosterone is one piece of the puzzle, but it is exactly that, right? All these different hormones work in unison with one another. And if we zoom in and isolate testosterone and we just go, this is high or low, these are my blood values, and we don't zoom out a little bit and think about how, let's say, cortisol dominance might be impacting that number, or your TCF7L2 gene. Maybe you've got some issues with insulin going up and down all day. Maybe that's impacting that number. Maybe your thyroid is impacting that as well. So I think that it's more of a picture that needs to be painted of many, many moving parts, growth hormone, etc. So yeah, definitely testosterone is the one that we want to think about the most. And both males and females have testosterone, by the way. So it's not even a male-centric characteristic. But testosterone, there's genetic components, there's environmental components, there's lifestyle components. Then there's other hormone components, right? They all impact one another. So it's a big story that we got to tell. That's why we personalize it via genetics and all these different things.
Absolutely. So to reiterate, holistic hormone management is really what you're talking about. The role of diet, particularly healthy fats in hormone production. We always implement a patient or client-centric approach, N of one, in functional medicine and genomics, and the emphasis on treating the patient as a whole rather than just the symptoms. But the symptoms count, levels and amounts count. Like you said, the balance of all these different hormones, all that counts. So we'll maybe get into sort of lab values. And I love that you brought up thyroid and insulin and blood sugar, because we forget about those hormones in the grand scheme of things. And we often talk about the pituitary adrenal, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, if you want to include higher up brain centers in the grand scheme of things. Cortisol, when that's too high, and that's lack of sleep and stress that opposes natural balances, even if you otherwise are not genetically predisposed to running low T. So we got to do it, not just to pay homage to the rhetoric, but we got to do it because these are the underpinnings. First and foremost, if you can't get this, we spoke off camera about this, there's no point in UVing your ball sack if you haven't got the exercise in there first. Okay, half an hour spread eagle with a little bit of infrared light, it's not going to do the job. You have to first have eaten correctly that day, minimized your stress, maybe meditated, got the exercise in, And then maybe these biohacks are helpful. They're not unhelpful. We're not saying that, but we're saying get all this other stuff right. So let's talk briefly about what all this other stuff is, particularly stress, sleep, and dietary exercise factors. I mean, where do you start with your clients? What's your sort of hierarchy up, down?
Yeah, and I must say that is one of the gripes I have with the biohacking industry as a whole. I understand that we want to work smart, but it's 2024 and we should probably work smart and hard. That's always been my thing. It shouldn't be one or the other, because like if you get a lot of work done, let's say in 1 hour of the day, and you're like, yeah, I'm the most efficient guy, so I get it done in 1 hour. Well, why don't you do a lot of efficient work in 8 hours like everybody else, and you've gotten 8 times the amount of accomplishment, right? So let's work smart and let's work hard. Biohacking can amplify that baseline discipline, but you've got to start there, right? To what you alluded to, let's not sun our ball sack, but then not work out, not eat healthy food, not know how to breathe properly, be hunched over to our desk all day and not move our bodies. We got to start at that kind of upstream component there. So definitely what you said, I start where it starts. I've mentioned often this whole thing about the primal blueprint, right? That's always been a kind of template that I've operated under. Moving our body, eating real food, lifting heavy things. I would add grounding into that. So knowing that the human body kind of operates like a battery, that helps a lot, because we want to charge it up via all these different things. Usually I start with either sleep, diet, movement, the real kind of pillars of the healthy human body. If one of those is off, and I mean, like you don't sleep well at all, there's no way that you're going to have healthy testosterone, even if you've got the ideal setup with your diet or anything else. So I understand that sleep is a huge component. That's when we, amplify a lot of these anabolic hormones. Having the right micronutrients in your diet, the right essential fatty acids in your diet, and then moving your body. There's no reason why the universe would grant us testosterone if we never used our body, right? Because it's one of those main hormones associated with strength and vitality. So I really start with those normal pillars: movement, food, sleep. I think those are the most important. What do you think on that? Is there anything you would add?
I think because of it's a vicious cycle for a lot of guys, right? Because of lack of sleep, due to an overwhelming, sort of modern day requirement of excelling in the workforce. So let me just start here before answering that question and adding to what you've already described. I think we need to work hard. I think we need to play hard, and then we need to rest hard. And I think if you think about that being a sort of third of each of those components, or a third of your day. So we've got a 24-hour day, and we spend 8 hours within each of those thirds. We work hard 8 hours, we play hard 8 hours, and then we rest hard. By the way, within that resting, I don't just mean sleeping, because not all about the hours you clog on the pillow. It's about the quality that you bring through that depth of excellent sleep architecture that's going to contribute toward testosterone modulation and optimization. This vicious cycle I was going to allude to, which is we're overworked, overstressed, the propensity, and even our genes, most of us, our aptitude for over consuming the wrong foods, including alcohol, not sleeping effectively, and then not having the energy to exercise. This is the vicious cycle we're trying to break. So all these things contribute to very visible changes in men: weight gain, particularly around the belly, breast enlargement, gynecomastia, right? So large breast tissues that resemble female anatomy, a loss of body hair loss, it's not just the the cranium. And all of these are really, it's associated with decreased testosterone levels, along with that lethargy, fatigue, depression. That's a key symptom, by the way. If you're just feeling down in the dumps, you can't be motivated. It's a motivational experience to have optimal hormones. So lifestyle changes over quick fixes. This is not easy. And instead of immediately resorting to testosterone supplements, and no matter what format, because we'll get into the weeds on this too, there is nutraceutical, that is a vitamin mineral ingredient, then, maybe move on to some botanical herbal, which have a little more potent activity, perhaps in some instances for testosterone. There's bioidentical, there are peptides that influence the signals that hormones are thereby produced. And then, of course, there's hormone replacement therapy and even synthetic or analog, weight, bodybuilder level dosing and testosterone supplementation. Generally, I find in my clinical practice, patients are more satisfied overall and certainly healthier with comprehensive changes. Sometimes, if they've come to my clinic and they're seeking after testosterone replacement therapy, bioidentical or otherwise, they're not thinking there's going to be this huge overarching lifestyle change that we'd be recommending. And yet when they do have the compliance and willingness and participatory element to getting in place first, what they're going to experience is so many other side benefits than just if we were to give them testosterone. That's actually wrong for most people, just to give them testosterone. And that's what we'll talk about. But I think alcohol has got to be in there, full circle. I think that we're way over consuming alcohol. That's, pushing estrogen up in so many of us and tackling this sort of excess stress phenomenon. Those things are, I think, what persists that vicious cycle. And I got to say, coming back full circle to what you said at the top, somehow the societal belief that we can't be the man's man anymore, or somehow, we have to, become less, again, the vernacular escapes me, but, ego driven. I think it's okay in some ways to be that way, and I'm not going to be shy to say it. Why don't we at least offer up, we've talked about this on previous podcast sessions, but why don't we offer up at least generally these three archetypes, right? As we see in our, over 10,000 samples that we've done at the DNA company of the guy who's, let's call him average balanced for hormones, which still often runs, all of these archetypes run into problems. And then you've got sort of the more estrogenized male, and then there's more of the androgenized male. Do your magic as you typically do to describe what these three versions of a guy look and feel and show up like on a genomic panel.
What's really interesting about this is that myself and my father have quite different steroidogenic pathways, genetically speaking. And so you can really see the genotype. If he was here and we were standing next to each other, we're both like 6 feet tall, just under. But I outweigh him by probably 80 pounds. He's got a totally balanced profile. Right. So he's not making a ton of testosterone off of that initial progesterone, where I have a dominant profile. So I'm thick and he's not. And you can see it directly in the phenotype there with what our hormones kind of lend themselves as. So he would be more along the lines of that balanced profile. Right. So he's making just enough testosterone. I mean, he's perfectly masculine. He's got facial hair and everything else. But in his body, he's just not particularly thick. So that's going to be your more kind of balanced profile. You're making enough hormones to either look like a man or a woman, but it's not exaggerated, right? It's not amplified, right? So that would be the balanced guy. Whereas when you're dominant, you're going to have more exaggerated characteristics. So for me, I'm more estrogen dominant. That means I make a lot of testosterone, but later in the pathway, it's aromatizing a little bit more than I might like. So that lends itself to a different phenotype. I'm thick. I have a beautiful head of hair. There's good things to it, right? Because you're not as likely to go bald as someone who's more androgenized. Nice skin, those kinds of things that would typically be associated with estrogen dominance. That's what I have. If instead of aromatizing, all of that testosterone was androgenizing, not all, but a lot of it was androgenizing, that's when we get that Jason Statham kind of look, right? More likely to go bald, very mesomorphic as opposed to endomorphic, which is me, or ectomorphic, which is balanced, my dad. So they're ripped and they're shredded and they're big and they're strong and all these different things. So that's kind of what that downstream effect looks like. You're balanced, or you're androgen dominant, or you're estrogen dominant. You can kind of end up as a blend of a couple different ones. My lifestyle has led me to have a little bit more of an androgenized look. just years of weightlifting and doing the right things, I am actually 200 plus pounds, pretty lean and strong, so estrogen actually is useful and it's right as well. But you're going to look like one of those three things, right? And people talk about ectomorph, mesomorph, or endomorph. That's my take on it. It's the steroidogenesis pathway.
For sure. So a couple of things to tease out of that. People can start asking themselves this question about themselves or some of their family members to get a better understanding as to where they, if they don't already have a playbook, genomic, DNA 360 test that we provide to give this concrete answer as to where they might be. Again, this is genes. This is where we start. Lifestyle, as we'll get into, exposures to environmental toxins, all of these things influence. And sometimes, no matter how androgenized you are as a male, you still, through what's a very real thing, as much as menopause is, andropause, I believe, might enter into some deficiencies in testosterone and some of the other complementary hormones. But if you were to ask yourself, if yourself and or any family members experience male pattern baldness, as you described, that might mean that you are on the steroidogenetic pathway, quick to produce from progesterone, testosterone, then quick to produce dihydrotestosterone, which we'll talk about, and then sort of hold on to that stuff. So there's prostate health implications there as well. You probably bald earlier. You can ask yourself, do you or any of your male family members have a history of prostate health or related concerns? That also might be that sort of fast pathway, a little more sort of slow on the production of estrogen. Do you build muscles easily when you work out? You alluded to that. That might be that slow, CYP19A1 gene, aromatizing gene that we're talking about, but also maybe you're producing a lot of DHT downstream and holding on to that. And then there's have you always sort of maybe had lower than your cohort or friends libido? Do you sort of have a challenge making muscle and retaining abdominal fat? Do you find it difficult generally in the gym to build muscles as you're describing? All of this might mean genetically you are susceptible, your aptitude genetically is of an estrogen dominance. So and even the gynecomastia that we talked about, or the man more predisposed to man boobs. And I'd love to bring this sort of case example up to further elucidate this, because, and we'll get into the, specifics around why this is, but you can have a male. We have a lot of professional athletes that we've, consulted within the DNA company. This applies to them as well. But you can have this struggling andropause, male who's estrogen dominant in their genetics, and you can feed them testosterone. And we've seen this with some pro athletes go the wrong way. And you actually get the exact opposite of what you desire through treatment if you're really not paying attention as closely as you should as a clinician to the insights of the genes, the pathway of these genes, and as well what they're presenting with in that moment of time from a functional laboratory perspective. So by giving these individuals that are otherwise genetically estrogen dominant testosterone, you are literally feeding into the estrogen pathway. And these people go, what? I thought I was supposed to, better energy, more libido. I thought my muscles were going to start to, grow and repair. And they're getting fatter and they're developing more man boobs. Well, guess what? Their doctor probably should have also considered putting them on an aromatase inhibitor simultaneously to some additional testosterone. But I'm not saying that's the solution. I'm giving an elucidation of what happens in the male body when these genes are the way they are and toward estrogen dominance. And again, some people are going to disagree with me, even within functional medicine and biohacking community. This whole notion of andropause, it probably shouldn't happen. I'm not saying that we should shut down, like the ovaries of a female naturally start to shut down at a certain particular, our testes don't necessarily have that sort of same timing. But in this day and age, there is a significant reduction in testosterone levels in middle-aged men. That's why there is this general low T phenomenon. And again, the symptoms are depression, erectile dysfunction, rapid weight gain, certainly around the middle. And unlike women, men experience this gradual decline. About 40% of men in their mid-40s, that's the 40-40 rule, have low testosterone. And by earlier on, 18 or so, testosterone peaks, right? And then you start to sort of gradually go down. Scientists think about 1% to 2% a year on average. But if it's a significant, decline in midlife, and this is affecting 30, 40% of guys, it's because of all of these other factors, and we got to remedy those factors. We got to test better. We can't stop at testosterone. And of course, and now I think we should probably talk about, well, let's talk about testing. So when we're talking about, genetics, and you described some of those pathways and we teased out some of those archetypes, the lab testing that exists out there that your family doctor can do is extensive compared to what they actually do. So in finding a functional medicine practitioner is where I think most people with the desire to consider testosterone replacement or some variety of that should be going, right? I mean, they should be, considering somebody like yourself, looking at the DNA, and then maybe a functional medicine practitioner who's going to get into the detail of all of their different hormones. Would you agree?
I agree completely. And, an example of that would be if you go to a normal MD for, let's say, a thyroid panel versus a more functional based medicine doctor, it's going to be most likely totally different what they look at, right? A lot of just traditional MDs now, they look at T3, T4, and TSH. They might not even look at T3, which happens to be the actual active hormone, right? T3 levels are what's going to matter as far as how you feel. So you could have your TSH be a little bit high and they go, okay, it's time to look at it. They might only look at the T4 from there, right? Which T4 has to convert into T3. Meanwhile, you've got all these symptoms, but your T4 is okay. The conversion wasn't there though. Right. So if you go to more of a functional panel, they're going to look at reverse T3. They're going to look at antibodies in the event that you might have a Hashimoto's or some kind of a immune related thyroid problem. Is it high? Is it low? So that's the difference there. Real functional testing is going to incorporate all of that. And by the way, if you have your DNA done and you happen to have one of these issues, we can work backwards even further. If you have Hashimoto's, maybe you have 2 copies of GSTM1 and there's a potential there for leaky gut, right? So we can extrapolate. The more testing that you do, the more info we have. If you want to know what's going on inside of you, look. So yeah, definitely you need to test and then have a functional interpretation of those tests.
Yeah. And back to that example of that estrogen dominant male taking testosterone, and then all of a sudden over the course of 6 months, seeing that their man boobs are growing, they're losing more hair, and their libido goes down, and they have less energy, and going, what, like, WTF is happening? Your doctor has forgotten to actually take a look at sex hormone binding globulin and estradiol, because these will go up in that genomic example of, sort of being a fast aromatizer and maybe a slow 5-alpha reductase enzyme activity genetically. About 2/3 of the testosterone in your blood is bound to this sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. It's not really available for use by your body. And it gets, further, let's call it excited when, estrogen is up. And if you're aromatizing quickly and you're taking testosterone, guess what? Estrogen's up. So if that can't do anything, it has no choice but to bind more testosterone, SOL. So there's loosely bound testosterone. About 1/3 of testosterone, your blood's weakly bound to something called albumin, a blood-borne serological protein. And once that bond is broken, of course, this is essentially, testosterone that is able to circulate freely. So that's the free testosterone. And a small percentage of the testosterone in your blood, roughly between 2 and 4%, floats around freely. So it's a very small percentage overall. But when it is free, guess what? Your body can now use it. And then, of course, depending on your genetic aptitude, again, the 5-alpha reductase to convert it into DHT, which is a very potent androgen, all that stuff is not going to actually work for you. So bioavailable testosterone, loosely bound and free, those are the only kinds that work, not bound to sex hormone binding globulin that's too strong. It can't break free. The loosely bound and free compose your bioavailable, which has not just a greater impact, pretty much the only impact on your health than total testosterone at any given time. And the ranges are wide, standard. I'm just going to give general, I'm not going to get into the whole detail. Well, maybe I will quickly. 10 nanomoles per liter, or about 300 nanograms per deciliter. So Canada, US, UK, wherever you are in the world, to an upper range of 35 nanomoles per liter, about 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. So that's a wide range. So treat, the patient, as we say in functional medicine, not the symptoms or labs exclusively. So if I have somebody come to see me and they've got low libido, depression, can't sleep, excessive hip waist ratio, so beyond 1.5 typically, gynecomastia, loss of hair, it's the laundry list, but it's very typical. And they're, 250, maybe 300 nanograms per deciliter, certainly far from deficient. They're still low. They're low normal for them. And then I'd obviously be in first steps, depicting their genetics, and then implementing the basics before replacement therapy, like intermittent fasting. Let's get their insulin sensitized. Let's eat healthier fats, avoid the seed oils. Let's balance their blood sugar, right? Correct their A1C, avoid alcohol. And by the way, even phytoestrogens, over consuming, things like tofu and eating more cruciferous vegetables. What do we know about cruciferous vegetables, right? In the case of a certain male, estrogen toxicity. You have a favorite, go-to diet in this instance for guys who just seem to, phenotypically present this way, and maybe they're even, shy to do genetics or lab work? I mean, is there sort of a default that you'd recommend to anyone listening out there they should maybe try?
Yeah, I mean, I usually try to avoid defaults, of course, being that we talk about personalization so much, but that's where my whole practice has always kind of looped back to primal paleo concepts. Because if I don't know your genetics, well, I do know that you're a Homo sapien, right? So I start there and I go, okay, well, what's the appropriate human diet for starters? That's where we get into a kind of a paleo or maybe a Mediterranean or whatever type of a diet. Hesitantly carnivore. I think that there is some, evidence that could be one of our ancestral diets, and I think that it's got some correlations there with what I call those warrior signals, right? Where it's like we're sending our body the signals that we're hunters and we need testosterone. So that being said, I rarely recommend overly plant-based diets when it comes to testosterone levels, just because are you a hunter or a gatherer? And I'm sorry that this may trigger some people. I don't mean to, but I think that's where getting the saturated fats and things in there from animals is going to have that trickle-down effect of telling your body that we're hunters and we get enough cholesterol in our diets and things. So really just a low-toxin paleo diet with a fasting element, that's probably a great place to start, I would say, for most people. We personalize from there, of course.
Yeah. Because we promised we would maybe even talk about some of the environmental factors a little bit more, right? Let's get to sort of some of the useful information of what to avoid. Because sometimes this story is more about how you stay away from things that are impacting your testosterone levels before, of course, then jumping right into the quicker fixes, if you will, or the consumption of testosterone in supplemental form. So again, to recapitulate, so this vicious cycle, if there's poor diet, lifestyle, lack of sleep, extra fats accumulating, worse metabolic health, that's lower testosterone. Lower testosterone is less energy to exercise and feel crappy, which leads to sort of stress eating and less exercise and, all that stuff, which is then lower testosterone and so on and so forth. And you mentioned cholesterol. That's the primary precursor to pregnenolone, DHEA, and then downstream all the steroids that we're talking about: testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, DHT, et cetera. But it reminded me real quick, besides just environmental toxins, just those, exclusively those that we're exposed to more frequently through, in the industrial age and in manufacturing and even pharmacologics in our waterways, et cetera. Statins can lower testosterone levels in some people. Cholesterol is the major precursor, and you block that. And you end up actually further depressing testosterone. But there's also others. There's beta blockers, intended for hypertension or high blood pressure medication. Chronic use of antihistamines, right, for allergies. Some people have atrial fibrillation, so antiarrhythmic medication can actually oppose the opioid epidemic. Oh my God. So pain control and all that stuff and abuse of opioids is known to lower testosterone, and anti-anxiety, antidepressive medication. I'm not saying to anybody to get off these medications. Always talk to your doctor or pharmacist before changing anything you're doing. Our message is look into these things The conundrum with the antidepressants, we know this all too well. The DNA companies, we do a great job of looking at the executive function pathway as well. That's not always right for everybody, and that can actually make some people even worse. And at the same time, they're making them potentially worse. It's affecting their downstream testosterone. Okay, so the environmental working group, right? They put a lot of this work together, and some of their subsidiaries. One of them I know about and I love, called Cosmetic Database, a wonderful online database with, I don't even know how much it's grown more recently, like over 100,000 different chemicals and brand names that you can look up, right? Whether you have a shaving cream. Bruce Laurie. Do you ever read the book Slow Death by Rubber Duck? I mean, it's about 20, maybe 15, 20 years old now.
I can't say I have. It sounds interesting though.
Rick Smith, I think, and Bruce Laurie. Anyway, these guys locked themselves in a condo for the better part of a week and objectively did their full blood parameters on all these. At the time, were considered sort of like out there xenoestrogens and toxins and so forth. No one had heard of bisphenol A yet, and no one was looking at the bottom of their planet, let alone how we've gone the other direction, and they're not really being used to manufacture things with, because of that conscious awareness. The average population, they've been replaced with other crap that's equally as harmful, maybe more. But these guys locked themselves in a condo and they both did their blood work, and with that blood work, they lived a relatively normal day-to-day life, but within this contained environment that had new carpet, new couches, new upholstery, new furnishings, and window coverings, and all of that stuff that we know contains just an insane amount of fire retardants, right? They ate quite a lot of tuna fish to prove their point. They shaved regularly, their face and their chest with shaving cream. These day-to-day sort of general run-of-the-mill routine things we don't think about. And they did their post blood work analysis after a week or so, and these levels just skyrocketed. Yeah, this is anecdote, but scientists have proven this since in these alarming ways, that phthalates, parabens, fragrance, bisphenol A, dioxins, furans, heavy metals. The list is very, very long, and these things are testosterone interrupters, right? What are some of the others that you're aware of that you ask your clients to avoid?
So I normally I preface it by saying that we've got to be aware of this dichotomy, because we live in a world full of toxins now, and we have to remember that your hormones, they respond to the environmental signals that you provide. And if your body thinks we live in a toxic environment, it does not want you to carry on your offspring in that toxic environment. Evolution, right? It's just natural. Why would we bring offspring into a toxic world? So, I would say, let's say you smoke cigarettes, for example. Every half hour of your day, you're breathing in massive amounts of carcinogens. Your body's not going to reward you with testosterone and growth hormone. It doesn't want you to be horny, right? You're poisoned. It's not a good thing. So those are the ones that are obvious. I think beyond that, things like Wi-Fi, right? I think that we're still kind of learning what that's actually going to do to the human body, as it's such a recent phenomenon, but some evidence would suggest that it's carcinogenic. And it happens to be right in front of me right now, coming out of this laptop. That's why we use that's why I use this Lila Q device, right? And we have these wearables and these different things that we can do to kind of counteract it. But, toxins in the air, toxins in the water, toxins in the soil, toxic relationships, toxic mindsets, right? We talked a little bit about depression earlier, and I think there's an interesting correlate there, because let's say you have, really like suicidal thoughts, like to that point. How is your body supposed to grant you a hormone to help you carry on your species if you are thinking about ending your species, right? Ending your own bloodline. If your own brain is sitting there ruminating on thoughts about, I don't want to live anymore, man, I don't know how you're going to get granted a whole bunch of testosterone. So I think like chronically negative thoughts, the downstream cortisol effect that gives you, I think all of those things are toxic to your testosterone profile. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, they're 100%. Part of that vicious cycle that we're describing earlier. Can't break free of that, then you're in constant chronic depletion. Okay, so supplements, in this sort of top down, if people are interested in boosting testosterone, balancing estrogen downstream, DHT, all of the hormones that, make up this overall symphony orchestra. Let's start with maybe flipping through the vitamin, mineral, nutraceutical realm over to the botanical, over to the at least a few of the peptides, and then from there, actual replacement therapy. So we know zinc, that's key. So I think it's very well studied. Men who receive at least 30 milligrams, maybe even more to 100 milligrams, showed significantly lower aptitude or predisposition to testosterone deficiency, particularly free testosterone. So that means they're increasing their free testosterone. Vitamin D deficiency, we know that causes low testosterone. And then I think some of the ones people forget about are magnesium, because of course that helps with insulin sensitivity, and boron. Boron's not just for the bones. Boron's anti-inflammatory, bone healthy, but also helps to substantiate testosterone, but also through that sex hormone binding globulin pathway. What are some of your any vitamin? There's biotin in there, isn't there? Biotin's a really helpful hormone, or rather B vitamin that helps to increase testosterone. What are some of your favorite botanicals?
So I've got a few kind of go-tos that I recommend for that. And just to rabbit hole on the micronutrients for a second as well, we got to make sure that we get your B vitamins right, not because they directly create testosterone, but because they facilitate the methylation cycle, and hormones must be methylated, right?
Yeah.
So in your DNA, we can get very specific about the form of B12 and the form of B9, to make sure that your methylation cycle is supported properly. Um, and, we genetically look at zinc, like you mentioned, that's hugely valuable. What I would say about zinc as well is if we're going to supplement with it, we may want to include a copper source at some point. And that's where I rely on animal organs, actually, for my supplementation there. I have like a combo of all these different animal organs. The thing that's actually highest in zinc actually happens to be testicles, right? Like grass-fed testicles, you can get them, and it's got bioidentical hormones in there and these micronutrients that equate to testosterone. Funny enough, right? There's that like supports like concept when it comes to organs. So I favor that because when you take a supplement that is actually comprised of animal organs, it's actually pretty balanced, right? It's got some of the copper and these cofactors involved. So I favor that over a synthetic supplement. But that being said, getting into the botanicals, I think we also need to be aware of mineral content. So things like shilajit, fulvic and humic acid, I think that really supporting your mineral storages makes a big difference with testosterone levels. Beyond that, it's these herbs, right? We've got so many different things that these weird, like Phaedogia agrestis is like a shrub from Nigeria that happens to increase bioavailable testosterone. Tonkat Ali is another one that I'm a fan of, and especially if your SHBG happens to be elevated, like you mentioned earlier, all the free testosterone you have is being binded up, and so it's not truly free. Well, Tonkat Ali happens to increase the release rate of free testosterone from being binded, right? So some of those supplements are great. A lot of these different herbs have some kind of contradicting studies, right? I think a lot of the evidence in some of them is more anecdotal than properly studied. Like, for example, tribulus, I happen to find it quite effective. There may be other guys that take it and don't quite notice an effect. But I do think tribulus is one of those ones that's worth giving a shot. Maca, another one that I'm a fan of. It goes great in a coffee or something like that. It almost has a little bit of a nutty flavor to it, and it's been shown to increase libido, energy, nitric oxide, all these different things. So yeah, start with the minerals on that one, and then adding in some of these herbs can be pretty effective, especially in combination with one another.
Absolutely. I love ashwagandha. I think it shows some promising safety efficacy first, but also, some statistical inference on some of these. I mean, very few as you're mentioning, double-blind, randomized controlled trials, obviously, on a lot of these botanicals. But it's an Ayurvedic herb that works well to balance the stress hormones, helps, it's known as an adaptogen, seem to have some protective effects on, you know, uh, chronic stress, which ultimately then breaks that vicious cycle that we were talking about. I mean, think that fenugreek, fenugreek's another one. Did you mention fenugreek already?
I didn't, but I'm a fan of
Yeah,
fenugreek. Yeah.
fenugreek, that's traditionally an herb, used almost as a spice in India and other parts of the world. And, I'm familiar with a few studies, at least anyways, that supplementing with roughly 500 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams standardized. This is important about botanicals. You standardize them to their active ingredient. Found that total serum testosterone increased some 10 or so percent. So there are interesting studies around fenugreek. When you sweat, by the way, after consuming fenugreek, you smell like maple syrup. I don't know if you've experienced that. I've tried it. And then there's nutraceuticals that go beyond vitamin mineral that we talked about, or even botanical. There's some, although controversial, evidence around D-aspartic acid. The whole pathway from aspartic acid through to gonadotropin releasing hormone, which, by the way, we'll talk next about peptides, and into luteinizing hormone, testes producing more testosterone. So I think that's worthy of consideration as well. And you mentioned tribulus, one of my favorites as well, is and I, just because I love the name, I always have to make the call out to the horny goat weed.
Yeah.
Lower level science, but I think it's worth describing. And I can't talk enough about vitamin D. I think vitamin D is just that unsung hero. Okay, so how about the use of peptides? It's becoming a lot more popular, in the world of functional medicine and biohacking. Treatments can include things like CJC 1297. And I guess, prefacing this whole concept, the whole concept is that, a peptide is a signaling agent that ultimately then gets your body to then produce more of the hormone that you might be in question for deficiency for in the first place, right?
Yeah, so it's more of an agonist, right, than an actual, like, you're not upping the levels as a simple 1-2 thing in the body. It's actually a sequence of amino acids that are very specific. And this is going to be different than just taking a BCAA or something. Like, these are long strings of amino acids that are very targeted and, by the way, intelligent. So the more you look into peptides, there's actually some very specific pathways that you can target. So, like, for example, growth hormone agonists are definitely popular. I've yet to dabble in them. But things like ipamorelin and tesamorelin, those are really popular for, again, being an agonist for growth hormone. You're not injecting growth hormone, you're increasing more of your own. So that's going to have all those various anti-aging properties, as well as, if you're into performance, it can help with muscle building and strength and these kinds of things. Fat loss would be another one. So peptides, I mean, I've only dabbled in a handful of them. BPC 157 I've used, carbon 60 I've used, a number of topical ones I've played around with as well. But I do think that they're going to be a bigger and bigger deal moving forward because of the efficacy and the seeming lack of side effects. They seem to be safe and as opposed to, let's say, steroids, which, if you take a steroid, it's like each one of these mechanisms is like a little keyhole. And when you just put a whole bunch of growth hormone or a whole bunch of testosterone into the body, that keyhole might unlock muscle building. It might unlock libido. It might also unlock acne. It might also unlock prostate enlargement or cardiac hypertrophy, hair loss, any number of these things. So it fits into a bunch of keyholes. Whereas something like a SARM or a peptide is way more selective once it gets into your body.
Right. Call those analogs, right? Yeah. And again, just to sort of drive this home for people who aren't familiar with this, and because it's becoming more and more popular, there are those that specifically target the growth hormone releasing hormones, right? The precursors, like sermorelin, for example, not just the CJC 1295 I was talking about, but that stimulate the pituitary gland to produce more growth hormone. A lot of anti-agers talk about this, but ultimately what we're talking about is supporting the natural production of testosterone by enhancing growth hormone levels in the first place. But what I like about these is they're often not just addressing, well, certainly they're not at all just addressing low testosterone. They're solving for muscle mass. They're solving for better sleep, solving for better insulin production, so forth. Then there's the growth hormone releasing peptides, right? Which are different than the growth hormone releasing hormones. So hexarelin, one of the stronger ones. And that's another thing. I think dosing is another thing altogether. We're dosing out botanicals or dosing out vitamins or dosing out peptides, getting the dosing all messed up. I mean, it's probably another podcast altogether, but we could probably be using these peptides in a lot lower amounts than we are. I wouldn't call them microdosing like mushrooms, but we're probably using them at too high a dose. Same with hormone replacement therapy. And then there's the gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Analogs, the GnRHs, like triptorelin. And yeah, in clinical practice, in Canada, we've got a lot of restrictions on these things, and of course, their delivery systems and so forth. But peptides, under the guidance of a trained healthcare professional that knows exactly what to do, these are, right up there, I think, theoretically with, botanicals and the appropriate use of botanicals and nutraceuticals that are genetically guided. I mean, that's really the bottom line when I drive home is once you understand your genetic pathways through the use of a test like the DNA 360 test, then you've got your instruction manual. You know where you want to dial up or dial down, because of that example we've seen one too many times, including, as I mentioned, in pro sports. Not knowing you're estrogen dominant and simply seeing a low free testosterone, in your mid 30s and going, "Oh, I just got to put more T in my body." No, that's probably very wrong. And then on to hormones themselves. Before getting into the direct pass go collect $200, inject me with testosterone, what about the precursors? What about DHEA? What about pregnenolone? These are worthy of trying sort of at the right dosages, made in concert with or before just the use of testosterone. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I remember DHEA was a big thing, and like I'm not sure if in Canada you can even get it.
No.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones on that list. But yeah, it's definitely a precursor, right? That can also increase a number of hormones, right? So it's one of those ones. It's like a building block. I think
if you're low, I mean, if you're deficient, like vitamin D, if you're found to be low along with testosterone, you solve for, both, and one can complement. You need less testosterone in that replacement therapy, right?
Yeah. So if you're going to dabble in, let's say, HRT, you may want to start with something like a DHEA instead, right? To just see if you can kind of amplify these signals first. Like it's when you go to actually go on something like HRT, you've got to think about the pathways, right? You got to think about, are they going to put me on progesterone? Are they going to put me on DHEA, testosterone? Where does the intervention actually need to lie genetically? Because what you said, if I'm totally estrogen dominant and I just add in testosterone, not knowing my CYP family of genes and enzymes, it's just going to steer it towards estrogen. And then they're going to go, oh, I guess I need more. So then your doctor's going to up your dose. Well, now we've increased estrogen that much further, right? So knowing the pathway and then knowing the precursors and where to place that intervention can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we're huge fans of D-glucarate, calcium D-glucarate, diindyl methane, indole 3-carbinol. And that's because we often see individuals who, whether they're on botanical or precursory or peptide or actual hormone replacement therapy, have conversion issues, right? Downstream, what are they doing with these hormones? Because at the end of the day, we have to metabolize them and then get them out of our body, the metabolites, that is. We have to detoxify these hormones. And some people do better jobs than others. Some people, they kind of accumulate these metabolites and or are a little bit imbalanced for what we know best, at least scientists have studied most, is the 2, 4, and 16 hydroxyestrogen metabolites. And if you're skewed a little toward the 2, then you're maybe lucky. If you're skewed more 4, 16, that's where you want to intervene, and calcium D-glucarate might help you pull this out of your system better, and indole 3-carbinol, diindomethane, which of course comes from the cruciferous family, kale, cabbage, mustard greens, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, etc. Helps your body. You can never eat yourself, of course, the therapeutic ranges. That's what I like to say all the time. You have to like take a supplement in this instance. It can shift your metabolites from unhealthy to more healthy. And by the way, got to mention one of my favorite tests. There's controversy around it. It's not the only test out there to be used. It's in concert with serology, blood work for these labs, also obviously knowing your DNA. But the Dutch test, which is the dried urine comprehensive hormone test, DUTCH. This is literally an overlay. This is a urine analysis of current, now, lifetime, objective. What are my hormones doing, particularly their metabolites, in the face of what I'm supplementing or taking as hormone replacement therapy, and my genes? How are they expressing? And it really helps to tweak, up or down on a given pathway through these various personalized interventions. So I really like to use the Dutch test as a complement to the standard conventional testing, which again, we just got to start with genes. It's the playbook. We got to understand where we are predisposed to, because as guys, right? I mean, if we start androgen dominant, we don't start. If we are genetically androgen dominant, and we start our lives this way, and then through our environment and through sort of maybe poor diet, lifestyle, and so forth, we're setting up for a harder, faster fall later on into andropause, right? That might be why sort of the underpinning of a midlife crisis hits some guys harder than others. Do you agree?
I agree. And I think that knowing it, I always say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. If I know early on that I'm going to likely have DHT toxicity that can be, cumulative for my whole life, well, I know what can help counteract that, right? Green tea extract and these various things that can kind of take the edge off of that. Knowledge is power, so knowing your genes, knowing your microbiome, knowing your detox pathways, all of these things can help to counteract that. I always say, like, take what you're given and then just create the best case scenario, right? So we don't talk about genes necessarily in a good or bad format. We say, this is what it is. Now, what do we do to get the best out of it? And what do we do to mitigate the downside of it? So there's no bad pathway. It's just that we need to know where to place our interventions.
Right. I've just been reminded as we sort of work toward tying up this episode, coming up to an hour now, one of the most, I guess, not pet peeve, that's the most from the younger generation, one of the questions I get asked most is, will ejaculation decrease my testosterone levels? I get that all the time. Ejaculation, whether it's, first of all, if your libido is very high, you probably don't have to worry about testosterone. But I think the question really stems more from what this younger generation's exposed to online, pornography and so forth. And this question is, am I watching too much porn? Ejaculation results in changes in prolactin. There's an increase, and of course, dopamine. There's that surge, and then there's that temporary decrease. But it doesn't result in changes in testosterone. Prolactin and dopamine, which we look at, at the DNA side of things from the executive function. They're both involved with testosterone, but they don't influence testosterone levels acutely. So that I think we can sort of hopefully put that to rest. But as we've talked about, sleep affects testosterone levels. Not more better, but the right amount and depth. Quality sleep is going to increase testosterone. Exercise, building muscle, which is a conundrum for some people because low testosterone makes it harder. But the more you push, the more you build. The more you build, the more testosterone goes up. And of course, that whole hip waist ratio that so many of us struggle with. And I don't pretend to be one that doesn't struggle at all. To your point earlier, I'm one of those genetically estrogenized or more dominant estrogen males. So I have to work harder, but gaining fat or excessive fat around the midline decreases testosterone levels. It's just irrefutable. And diet impacts as well. So getting all that right, testing yourself correctly, and then entertaining sort of this top down, starting with nutrients, micronutrient supplement form, botanicals, some of them we've mentioned, and then maybe into some of the peptides if necessary, and then the hormone replacement therapy if actually necessary. Any final thoughts on your side, Jess?
Yeah, I think that the momentum game I always won't shut up about matters here as well. Like we talked a little bit today about the vicious cycle, and all these things, and it kind of is akin to like a downward spiral. People love going online and seeing some celebrity having a downward spiral, and they gained a bunch of weight, and then they got a divorce, and things started going downhill. I like to talk about upward spirals, right? Because that's a thing too. With testosterone, it's like if we can start making good choices over and over again, I'm going to eat this instead of that. I'm going to hit my lift instead of just scrolling Instagram, and then, I don't have time now. The combination of good choices is cumulative, right? And it builds you up, and you can actually start to amplify and increase positive hormones and positive feelings within yourself, so that leads to confidence. When you're confident, you're going to accomplish more things in the world. So give yourself that reward system with your hormones and understand the signals we give it is what matters. Your body's going to grant you more and build more of these positive hormones if you give it the right signals. So let's get out and let's start that upward spiral. Positive thought, positive action. You only control you.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up this episode of Man Up, let's reflect on the crucial role testosterone plays in men's health, but not make it be the end all and be all. And since its discovery, believe it or not, back in 1935, we've learned that testosterone isn't just a hormone. It's the cornerstone of male vitality, influencing everything from muscle mass to libido, bone density, mood. We've talked about most of it. We peak in our 20s and it gradually declines. That's a fact of life. And it leads to some pretty significant physical and physiologic changes, including potential increases, as we talked about, in body fat, decreased motivation and mood changes. But understanding these changes, that's what's vital, especially as you enter your 30s, when testosterone levels typically decrease about that 2 to 3% a year, as we talked about. And this natural decline can be compounded by lifestyle factors, such as less physical activity due to increasing responsibilities at work and home. However, the strategies we talked about today, of which you're always going to talk to your doctor or pharmacist about before starting anything, and of course, get your DNA 360 test to understand your playbook. Strategies like maintaining quality sleep, informed by DNA, engaging in weight-bearing exercises, managing body fat, all of these things can help mitigate the effects of low testosterone and sustain testosterone levels. So it's clear that maintaining testosterone is not just about enhancing physical performance, but about preserving overall health and well-being. And remember, testosterone is also not just about masculinity. It's about maintaining a balanced, healthy life as you age. So guys, thank you for joining in, and continue to take an educational, motivated step toward optimal health and wellness. And that is another Man Up episode. Justin, you're the best. Thank you for all you do. People can find out more about you at the DNA Company if they want consultation and clinical guidance towards optimizing their DNA and toward the best testosterone of their life, right?
Yes, sir. And follow me on Instagram too, if you like. Justin Harris Official. I'm going to be giving some more advice on testosterone at some point, I'm sure, on that channel.
Awesome. And I'm at Wylde on Health. That's at Wylde on Health on Instagram and most other social platforms. Until next time, man up.
Man up. Signing off.